All right, so let's go ahead and get into the last story that we have, which is more of so this is one of the big discussions that we've been talking about with you guys since a couple of weeks ago. You guys, throughout 2020, have brought up, okay, COVID has changed a lot of the landscape, especially when it comes to media and how to do it, how to develop it. And it's not just necessarily changed filming or TV. It's also changed games and how they're made and the precautions that have to be taken into account to be able to do that. And so one of the things that I wanted to tackle first, because I think the answers are going to be pretty much straightforward for it, as opposed to some of the complications we're going to be dealing with later, is we are on the eve of a new generation of games, or at least of gaming hardware. We have the PS5 and the Xbox Series X coming very, very soon. And there's already been discussion and confirmation, might I add, that we are looking at a price increase for games. Now, for the longest time, video games have been $59.99. They've gone up in some cases when it comes to various bigger games where they might highlight into the $69.99 territory. But it's never really gone further above that unless we're talking about deluxe editions, collector's editions, things like that have been a more recent aspect of the gaming industry. So now we're actually talking about doing I believe the AAA companies are basically saying across the board, it would be a general $20 increase in gaming retail prices. And I've seen tons of debates when it comes to this, that it's necessary, that in order to be able to construct these games, that it's become a necessity to be able to allow these game companies to survive, especially in, whatever rocky landscape that we have. I've also seen arguments basically saying that it's not worthwhile, that game companies need to learn how to spend their money better, which I think all of those are viable arguments. Yes, do prices increase? Naturally they do. But also, we've said it numerous times on this podcast that the exorbitant budgets of games has become a bit of a problem. And so at that point, let's actually get into this. So basically now what we're looking at is a base game would be $80, $80 to $85. I've even heard some cases where a base price might go up as high as $90 US. I'm not even going to try and equate that to other currencies because it either goes up or down, and it gets even more complicated than that. But now we're looking at collector's editions that would be, at bare minimum, $150. Maybe in some cases, depending on the company you're dealing with, $200. So you've already spent a pretty big fraction of what you spent on the console for this collector's edition of a game that better be worthwhile and better not be like, I don't know, another Fallout 76 kind of thing. And so at that point, let's actually get into this. Do we actually, I guess the first question that I want to get into here is, do we actually feel like game prices should increase because of the justification of this is a new console generation with much more hardware demands being put on the gaming companies to be able to develop quality games for them? I'm going to be honest, I get the concept, but I don't know if I'm there. That prices should go up based solely on those. But I'll open it up to you guys next.
I'm kind of in the same camp where I can see the argument, but I'm not quite there in terms of, I mean, when I look at some of the games that I own, some of the games that I've paid for, like 60, that's something like, okay, well, if it's something that I may not end up liking, then, well, 60, whereas paying $80, that's something that is going to really give me pause, thinking, okay, is this game that I'm considering getting really going to be worth it? Especially considering that not every publisher is going to be needing to sell things at that price. And since I'm someone who doesn't really play any of the major AAA games anyway, so I'm the kind of person who waits for price drops, who waits for clearance sales. And so it's one of those cases of, I can see developers and publishers trying to make the argument, but I don't really see a lot of people buying that argument and buying that game unless there's some sort of assurance of quality. I mean, it would have to be a really damn good game to warrant such a high price point.
Or even a company that would have the pedigree of games like, and we're talking pedigree from like the 90s, of the early 2000s, where we're like Blizzard kind of pedigree, or even in the 90s Virgin Interactive level of pedigree, to even remotely consider it.
Yeah, and especially considering that really a large chunk of this could be mitigated by not, investing hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars into these games and actually scaling back what you're trying to accomplish, because we're reaching this point where a lot of these companies are trying to rely on spectacle. They're trying to rely on like brand, like actors and well-known people, well-known brands, well-known IPs, when that isn't really going to be a guarantee. I mean, and this is as someone who's been kind of going through some of the indie games I've impulse bought. There have been some indie games that I've had a lot more mileage out of compared to the huge AAA releases, because there's just that next level of polish. They didn't try to be more than what they were trying to be. I mean, a good point of comparison would be something like, say, off the top of my head, would probably be something, I'm trying to think of one that more than just me has played. But
I think a perfect example of something that would be higher budget would probably be Death Stranding, considering the level of star power that went into that. And
it would be a good example would be comparing something like Death Stranding, which you play it once and you kind of had this experience, but there's not really much of an incentive to keep going unless you're a completionist. But then you've got something like, say, Bloodstained, which has more replay value.
Yeah.
Again, to a point where you've got like the boss challenge modes, you've got the randomizer roguelike modes, you've got the Zangetsu modes and stuff like that. A game that, although it had a sizable budget, it wasn't, to the exorbitant degree that something like Death Stranding was. And I mean, another good example would even be games like Stardew Valley, as opposed to, Anthem. Both games that involve a fair bit of resource management, but it's a case where one has just more polish and a more satisfying gameplay loop, whereas Anthem, or a better example, Destiny, is trying to wow you with the spectacle of it being a big, sprawling adventure. But again, it kind of goes to that same case of maybe instead of companies trying to wow us with spectacle and trying to use spectacle to generate interest, maybe they should, scale things back and kind of go back to basics and think, hey, let's actually, make a game that has a satisfying gameplay loop. Let's actually, get rid of some of these glitches that we tend to leave in our games to rush these out the door. Let's actually, we don't necessarily need to hire, Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen to play these characters. We can just, bring in established voice actors like David Hayter or Nolan North to do these same roles for, less than what it would cost to hire Norman freaking Reedus.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of things that could be done here that are raising up the amount that you have to give these actors. Like, I can't think that Norman Reedus, like, voiceover, okay, maybe he's fairly cheap, but you had him coming in and doing mocap too, which I'm guessing, like, there is a little bit of an added fee to put him in the suit every day and have him do it. Suit,
as well, in addition to putting him in the suit, also the case of licensing his likeness as well, because that's another. Because I know that was something that came up for things like Wing Commander, where you had
which, from what I understand, like with Norman, like him and Hideo reached an agreement for that. Like I heard that, and I haven't been able to confirm that, but Hideo pretty much found ways to be able to work things out with a majority of the actors in Death Stranding. But you're bringing up Wing Commander. Those were the days where you couldn't work out deals like that everybody was working off of standard fees. And you're talking about a stellar cast like Mark Hamill, John Rhys Davies, Tom Wilson, Malcolm McDowell, high-paid actors at the time.
Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of thing where game companies need to really... It's very much a case of we're running into the same problem that we're seeing in the film industry, where people keep thinking bigger, better, more flashy stuff, more shiny stuff is going to get people invested. But I'm reminded of the famous George Lucas quote, where a special effect is a means to tell a story. A special effect without a story is a very boring thing. And that's what we're running into with game design, is that, these very flashy cutscenes, these voice lines and mocap with these established actors, that we know from television. It's all well and good, but it doesn't really amount to anything if, the game plays like crap.
Well, and what's even better about that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think this also needs to be held into account. We've made this comparison numerous times of who's a good director and who's a bad director when it comes to Hollywood. And the consensus that you and I have come to a lot of the time, Romney, is the one who spends their budgets better and cheaply is the one that is considered the better director. And I would say the same thing counts of video game directors as well, being able to find ways to not have to purchase the likeness of the actor, but instead be able to find a mocap model who can be paid for cheaper, who can model that character and be able to do the movements with it. But at the same time, all you have to worry about with the quote AAA actor is paying the voiceover, which is significantly cheaper than having them in the film.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of something like that would be, what Capcom did with both Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake and Devil May Cry 5, where you still had the same voices and mocap actors. You still had Ruben Langdon, Daniel Southworth, Johnny Young Bosch voicing and doing the mocap for these characters, and then you just brought in these models and said, hey, we'll pay you to stand here, let us scan your face and your body so we can put them in the game, even if they're not really known models. And then they kind of did a composite, like, okay, we have these known models, and then we're going to tweak it here, and tweak it here, and tweak it here to make them look like the character we're trying to create.
And you probably know this better than me, but because I've only heard this as a concept of rumor with DMC5, is that in one of the ways that they reduced cost in being able to bring people like Johnny in is they didn't necessarily bring him in to do 100% mocap on everything. Like, you're saying the general concept model and everything like that, and then they brought somebody else to emulate. But they did bring him in for key scenes because he wanted to be able to know how Nero would act, when he's, for example, bitch slapping Dante. Because I know that's one of them. I know that's one of them that Johnny did. He was very happy about it and bragged about it. But you had to have them in for those key scenes, which means you're not paying them for the whole duration. You're paying them in segments, which is still acceptable for them. But at the same time, you're also saving a lot on budget.
Yeah, and I mean, another factor as well is that, especially given that there are just some movements that are physically impossible to be done by, even the most experienced of stunt people, you're going to have to animate those manually by hand. But another key factor is that the reason they were able to get Ruben, Daniel, and Johnny back was because they specifically contracted Ruben Langdon's production company, which does a lot of the mocap, because that's how they got the job on Devil May Cry 3, was that it was specifically his motion capture company that they commissioned and hired, and then brought them in for 4 and then later 5, because they figured, hey, we already have this infrastructure in place, we already have a working relationship with these people. Which was a good decision,
because I don't think anybody can envision those 3 not being in Devil May Cry at this point. So it worked out that way too, Ruben is synonymous with Dante.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, we already know what it looks like when we don't have those 3 in Devil May Cry. Granted, Ninja Theory was dealt a really bad hand because most of the controversial decisions was because Capcom was listening to Inafune thinking, we need to westernize it and not tailor it to the very fan base that made these games popular, and that'll definitely make Call of Duty numbers. Of course, there's a reason why Inafune crashed and burned the way he did, but it goes back to the main point, is that paying $80 for a game, it's kind of one of those cases of, that is a much larger investment. As a consumer, I'm going to very much be one of those, hey, I'm going to really, really be more choosy with what I purchase. Especially considering a lot of it may be available on PS5, because I'm still not even completely sold on whether or not I'm going to buy PS5 or the next Xbox yet, because there hasn't really been enough to entice me, because all we have coming out are games that are also going to be available on current gen. So there's no reason to be an early adopter at this point. And so I look at this and I'm just like, okay, $80, that's something that's going to make me, be a bit more reticent, thinking, okay, maybe instead of buying this day one, maybe I'll wait for a price drop. Maybe I'll wait for it to go on sale. Maybe I'll try a demo if I'm really, really that curious. But it's one of those cases where...
That's unprofessional of you. You should want a PS5 from the get-go.
Yeah, well, anybody who has a problem with that, well, if you're willing to pay for it, I'll get it. But unless you're actually willing to fund the Patreon, you can shut it.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Alex, I want you to chime in here because I want to get into the next little bit here because it's going to chain together. But given what is being justified here, is the $20 worth it? The extra $20 for a game?
I guess this is a case where you're going to have to sort of separate your own self from the overall thought of why prices might need to rise. And well, and I think the fact is, it might be time for the industry to raise prices, as the technology's improved leaps and bounds in the last decade alone since the launch of the PS3 and the PS4. And, as gamers keep demanding, everything to look like the best, the brightest, and the most polished. So that's the thing. Unless the attitudes of consumers change, right, then you're going to have to just pay out. It's just kind of a fact, but I don't see the attitudes changing. People complained that the Nintendo Mario re-release wasn't a shiny new HD version. It was mostly just a slightly polished up, spiffy re-release of the old games. People complained. People have been, talking nonstop about how the PS5 is going to have ray tracing and SSD, and it's like, well, this technology costs money, and all these new shiny features, you're demanding 4K, 8K, that costs money, that costs resources and time to invest, right? I get the arguments to the contrary. I get companies are scummy, and I know it's certainly not going to get rid of things like scummy microtransactions and loot boxes.
No.
Because whatever they want to do to get the most dollars and cents out of you, they're going to do. But
absolutely.
I think for all the other companies in between that want to deliver you a quality product and deliver it in next gen style, assuming they're not going for a retro indie style, like an old platform or whatever. Yeah, unfortunately, it's going to take another 20, 30, 10 to $30 price increase to start offsetting costs.
Okay.
Games are getting expensive. The dollar has depreciated over the time, and again, the overall resources and management. Back in the 80s, you could make a game with probably 4 or 5 people. These days, it's taking hundreds.
Well, you could still make a game with 4 or 5 people. It's just considered indie.
Yes, but I'm talking in terms of like your big AAA titles.
No. AAA, we're talking tens of hundreds of people on that team.
Right. But,
so
back in the 80s, back in 85, Super Mario Brothers would be considered AAA by that decade standards. And yeah, you could do that with
like 5-man team.
5 to 10 people these days, something like that. Not necessarily Mario, but a big AAA game, a big A-list console title. That's going to be like a 2 dozen people, maybe more. And yeah, there's definitely aspects of the industry that could change. Do they need Mads Mikkelsen and Norman Reedus? No, but
no.
Can you deny that Death Stranding was a success? Yeah, you can't. So I don't see the writing's kind of on the wall.
Yes, you can, or yes, you can't deny.
I
want to make sure, because I kind of heard you weird there.
You can't deny. I should say you cannot deny that Death Stranding was a huge success.
All right.
And yeah, maybe that's more the exception than the rule. But if the consumer and the gamers want to continue getting games of that kind of caliber and that kind of quality, that's going to take more money. And I think it's time that maybe we have to all start paying out a little bit more.
So at that point, I want to get into the next bit. I know that we talked about this before, but there are some people who are now joining us for the first time who have not heard us discuss this. And I think it needs to be considered when it comes to AAA. Is bigger always better? We've talked numerous times about the exorbitant budgets that are around a lot of these games. And because of the exorbitant budgets, they have to be these huge MMO-like colossal monsters of games in order to be able to do anything. And I know that some people will bring up the example of Breath of the Wild. And while Breath of the Wild is a big map, I would contest that a better example would probably be something like Red Dead Redemption 2, where you have a colossal map where you might not be able to get as much done in it or it might not even be a third as much populated as Breath of the Wild, but a lot of that is because of Breath of the Wild's map being the size that it is, and they incorporated that into it. But we have a lot of these exorbitant budgets that are going into features that may or may not actually have to be in this game, but they have to be because this other game's doing it. And it doesn't make sense in our game, but damn it, it's got to be in there because the corporate people want it. And so at that point, I want to bring this up again, A, because people haven't seen our actual discussion on that, but also because we're looking at a new generation where this could be one of the things that needs to be fixed. Could we cut down these budgets and be able to tell, instead of big old 75-hour games, maybe smaller 25-hour games, and be able to actually see better profit margins from them than we would the big 75-hour games? The examples that I will always bring up is basically anything Amy Hennig has worked on in her entire career. I didn't even know this. Now I do, that Amy Hennig is pretty much responsible for a lot of games that I love. She was either part of the story team or she was part of the character team or something like that. I was just barely told that, yeah, she was part of one of my favorite game series ever, The Legacy of Kain. An example of a 20-hour game that is timeless. And it doesn't have to have the big exorbitant budgets or the huge talent trees or anything like that. It still outshines because of story, because of the voice work, and because of the world that you were trying to build. And so at that point, do we need to actually bring this up again? Do we actually have to look at the concept of reducing some of these exorbitant budgets to maybe reduce the price of the game so that it can then profit more?
Yeah, well, it is definitely something worth considering, and I would argue that it is possible, mostly due in large part to the fact that we have a lot of games that pick and choose a lot of disparate elements from a lot of these other AAA titles, but they never find a way to actually make them cohesive. And especially it comes down to whether the kind of what the ultimate goal of the game is. The goal of the game to allow the player to explore? Is the goal of the game to tell a story? Is the goal of the game to basically have you play it on a regular daily basis? And those are factors that really need to be considered as part of the design. A good example of a game that I finished recently that had really bad pacing problems because you can tell that they hadn't hammered that out in the design was Castlevania Lords of Shadow, where the way the levels and everything was paced was really, really slow and bogged down and frankly arbitrary. And then you run into that same issue. I mean, a good example is something adding an open world. I guess a good example would be Final Fight Streetwise, trying to basically be like Grand Theft Auto when it was never meant to be. I think a large problem, it kind of goes back to that same pre-production problem where people need to actually, rather than trying to throw in everything and please everyone, people need to understand that, hey, if you have a very focused, fun experience, people will flock to it. A good example of a game that has proven this is Streets of Rage 4, where it didn't try to add a whole bunch of arbitrary features. It just took what made the previous games work, brought them up to a standard for modern game design, and made a fun experience that is fun to replay and revisit time and time again. And it didn't need to add a whole bunch of extra bells and whistles. And I think that's a really part of the issue here, is that we're running into a point where game companies are trying to find a way to please everybody, trying to market established titles to fans who weren't really interested. Again, it's the same problem that Devil May Cry had with Devil May Cry 4, where Capcom was expecting it to make Call of Duty numbers, even though they failed to consider the fact that Devil May Cry, in and of itself, was a very niche type of game with a very niche type of audience. It's the same case where a fighting game is not going to attract the same type of player that you're going to get from a first-person shooter or from an RPG.
Which this is something that has to be taken into consideration. You know, the fact that I'm saying that we have to reduce this, a lot of game executives are going to look at that and go, well, why are we even putting money towards this if it's just towards one demographic as opposed to all of them? Because unfortunately, some executives just kind of work that way. Why don't we appeal to everybody instead of just one niche demographic? Here's the problem, though, is that gamers are these niche demographics. They really are. There's no one size fits all. Some people like shmups. Some people like RPGs. Some people like Call of Duty. Some people like Overwatch. And there's reasons that all of those work. And so at that point, like, I see it as an overall victory if you just cater to the niche. And maybe, just maybe, because a lot of games have been able to do this as well, get somebody to look at it. Get somebody to look at it and invest. And all they have to do is that, and then a friend who is a fan will bring them in. And then at that point, you have a new customer.
especially considering that one of the big reasons that leads to a game's success, it's not marketing, it's not having a bunch of arbitrary features, it's word of mouth. I mean, when you consider the success of games like Pac-Man and the fact that it basically spread all over the place because people played it in the arcades, told other people about the game, and naturally it spread from there. Same case with games like Streets of Rage or even Street Fighter being like, hey, there's this really fun game that is in this particular genre. And that's what leads. I mean, considering the success of games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Minecraft, Among Us, a lot of these games that just focused on the one thing it wanted to do, did it really well. And then, granted, YouTube has played a large part in a lot of these games becoming popular, but it shows that, hey, if you're catering to a specific niche, it's better to basically do one thing really, really well than to do a million things poorly. And that's something that the AAA publishers really need to understand. Capcom has even learned this lesson. That's why they've had a bit of a resurgence with the Resident Evil remakes and with Devil May Cry, because they realized, okay, rather than trying to please everyone, let's just take what made these work and just do this really, really well. And it paid off with 7. It paid off with the 2 and 3 remakes, although 3 is still up for debate. And that's probably what they're banking on with Resident Evil 8, because they realize, hey, instead of trying to, make Resident Evil into Call of Duty, just letting Resident Evil be Resident Evil worked pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. And you kind of pointed out the big aspect that I want people to take away from is that they didn't try to please everybody. Because, I don't know, this is a part of real life. If you try to please everybody, you'll end up upsetting somebody. And so at that point, I wish the gaming industry would take this back into account. I'm not saying that you can't still make games like that. Go and make your Fortnites. But at the same time, maybe you don't need to be making 5 different versions of Fortnite as far as budget. Maybe you can have one big Fortnite, and then you can have a couple of other smaller projects that are being worked on, that are creatively made. As RPX just put in our chat, where games are once again made for gamers by gamers. And specifically on the stories that they want to tell. And that's a big problem, is when you have those big exorbitant budgets and it fails, all the executive sees is the failure. They don't see that, you still got this audience, which is a big problem with MMOs these days, is, everybody expects those World of Warcraft numbers or for it to be a competitor. And then they look at the, what I would call the success that Star Wars The Old Republic, Final Fantasy XIV, Final Fantasy Star Online 2 have been able to share as a success. They don't look at it that way because it's not 13 million people playing it, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very much the same case. I mean, another close example would be the fighting game scene, where it's a case where people are immediately expecting fighting games to hit those major Evo numbers, but as ArcSys has proven, like, you don't necessarily have to be, Capcom or Namco to build an audience. I mean, for the longest time, Guilty Gear was very much an underground fighting franchise where only certain people really knew about it, but because of that small but passionate fan base, it gave ArcSys what it needed to eventually license themselves out to other companies, and that's what eventually led to stuff like Dragon Ball FighterZ, where they basically looked and said, hey, we have experience making these really popular fighting games that have a really strong fan base and have tournaments all across the globe.
That's one thing that I think a lot of big game executives don't understand anymore, is that, a lot of these game companies were small businesses, and they had their niche audiences where they'd earned the loyalty. And so then at that point, now they're just like, oh, well, it's Guilty Gear, it's totally going to resonate with everybody. No, it's not. That's not.
No.
There's a reason that there was a small audience that grew over time supporting ArcSys. And now why they can do projects like Dragon Ball FighterZ is because they have the loyalty. They have the faith behind the brand. And unfortunately, when you talk about companies like Bethesda, they may have had the faith back in the day. I would argue they didn't. But now they certainly don't.
No, I mean, they had it up until Skyrim, but it's very much in the post-Skyrim era where a lot of that goodwill has since gone underground, especially when you look at how they've handled the properties that they have acquired, like Fallout and Doom and a lot of these other companies. It's just a case of where you have that issue where they aren't understanding what made these IPs as influential as they were. I mean, and that's pretty much the key thing here, is that these companies need to actually understand that, hey, rather than trying to take all of the pie, maybe be happy with the 1 or 2 slices you get, because if you try to take all of the pie, nobody gets the pie. But if you're satisfied with the slices you get everybody gets the pie, and naturally that means that whoever's making the pie is going to make more pies, because then it means, oh, more people are satisfied with the pies.
Okay.
And so it's just a case. It's the same case you see with films that try to basically appeal to everyone or try to be the next big thing. The best example I can think of a film that crashed and burned because it tried to do what Marvel did was the reboot of The Mummy, where it was basically trying to be...
Yes.
Yeah, it was basically trying to be the new MCU, and it was trying to rush straight to the Avengers, not realizing that Marvel, and by extension Disney, took more than 5 or so years to lay the groundwork before we got Avengers. People forget how long it actually took and the level of buildup they had to see.
Hence why Justice League and this Monster Universe failed. They didn't take the time and investment.
Nope, they basically wanted to rush straight to the big team-up, and even DC crashed and burned because they thought, oh, well, maybe if we do the team-up first and then do the solo movies. But, again, it's that classic case of people just need to understand that same classic thing. If you try to appeal to everybody, you'll appeal to nobody. Like, we see it with films, we see it in video games. This is why, more recently, I've been having more fun with a lot more of the indie-developed titles, because they at least know what they want to be, they know what they're trying to do, and they do it fairly well, to some degrees. There have been some indie titles I've played where they've tried, they made a valiant effort, but maybe something along the way they stumbled a little bit, but that happens. And so in terms of trying to reduce these budgets, the companies just need to understand that, yeah, gaming is a multimedia sort of thing, but rather than trying to force everything to be this vast multimedia franchise, focus on the core game loop. Focus on the key thing that you want the player to do. Sadly, this is kind of something that a lot of the gacha games understand is, okay, well, we want to condition our players to play this game every single day and to keep coming back to it. And
that looks really enticing to a lot of gaming executives. Coming back every day to do your dailies or whatever.
Yeah,
and it's one of those things that I'm kind of mad that MMO's introduced and now has kind of wrecked things for mobile.
Yeah, I mean, mobile, it's now making its way to PC and console. I mean, when you consider the number of the gacha games that the Switch is getting as a result, it's one of those cases where, I mean, as much as I hate them, the companies behind those games understand what they're trying to do. It's a case of, hey, we know how our game loop works. We know how to implement these Skinner box type designs, and companies just need to understand that, all the spectacle in the world isn't going to amount to anything. I mean, a good example of a game that tried to wow us with spectacle but crashed and burned was Clive Barker's Jericho, because they thought, oh, we have Clive Barker, this massive, well-known horror
we have
writer.
The one guy who was able to make Hellraiser. Oh, that's gonna totally get us, Call of Duty money or whatever kind of money.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same case with Daikatana, where it's like, oh, John Romero, one of the guys behind Doom, and it didn't really work.
Yeah,
and that's the thing. It's very much one of those game companies need to go back to basics and need to focus on making games that do one thing really well, and that's even if you are making an open world game, you've got to make that open world worth exploring. You've got to make the objectives and stuff you do in this open world actually worth investing in. I mean, this is the difference between something like Saints Row 4, where it kind of is almost a parody of the open box genre, as opposed to, well, Final Fight Streetwise is probably the only other example. The only example of one that
I love
did it
that
poorly.
Streetwise is an
I'm sure there's plenty
here.
of. Because, again, it's a classic case of Capcom wanting to create their own version of Grand Theft Auto without understanding what made Grand Theft Auto work. And it's the same case where they even did their whole beat-down Fist of Vengeance game that was pretty much, the exact same thing. It's very much a case of where, if you want to make an open world game, then you've got to find a way to make that open world worth exploring. Whether it's like, oh, you find this rare equipment by doing these quests, like you see in Monster Hunter, or by creating a story that's actually worth investing into, like you see with things like Stardew Valley, Rune Factory, or even to a certain extent. I know there have been examples of like open world games that aren't as focused on combat, but still draw you in based on the stories you get involved with. I think Stardew Valley is like the only example I can think of, but
Stardew Valley, Fez would technically be, well, I hate to bring up Phil Fish here, but it is. Like, it's one of those games that encourages you that way. Another one that somebody brought to my attention was a game called Alwa's Awakening that also is kind of, it basically prides itself more as a puzzle platformer than it is about combat.
Yeah, and that's the key thing. It's a case of, rather than trying to throw in features from every major successful AAA game, you should look at how they use those features and find a way to make a gameplay loop that actually builds off of it. And that's something that developers just aren't willing to do. I mean, when you look at how EA has handled a company like BioWare, a game company that was known for making very story-driven role-playing games, and then basically trying to make them make an MMO, which granted, yes, they had experience working on things like Star Wars with the Old Republic, but that's a classic example of, oh, let's take this company that's good for making single-player, story-driven experiences with really well-written characters and make them make an MMORPG and expect it to be as successful, which, granted, there was that initial hype from the Old Republic, but that slowly died off as people just went back to the MMO they were already playing.
And also another thing that took a lot of people away from it was that, remember, this was around the time that free-to-play was starting to get coined, and it did not have good connotations when it came to that term, and a lot of fans left because they'd heard that BioWare was taking the Old Republic free-to-play. And so at that point, they were worried that they were going to get pestered and that they were going to have nothing but predatory microtransactions. You want to be able to get this unique gun or lightsaber, you got to pay for it. And so that actually hurt it. Thankfully, a lot of that audience has come back now that they've kind of figured out how the subscription model and the free-to-play model should work. And I will actually say, like, as a person who has recently gone back to the Old Republic while waiting for World of Warcraft Shadowlands, they've done a good job with it, and they've actually made it non-predatory. I love it.
Yeah, but it's very much a rare exception because, again, when free-to-play started being a thing, most people thought of the Nexon stuff like MapleStory and Mabinogi, and I speak as someone who used to play Mabinogi very regularly. But then you also have cases of people shoehorning in features into established MMOs that end up basically killing the MMO, like what happened with Star Wars Galaxy, where they had, because with the original earlier version of Star Wars Galaxies, it actually took time for your character to become a Jedi. You actually had to go through a lot of steps before you even got the lightsaber, which worked because it's like, oh, it's kind of like how it would be in the actual Galaxy, where you can't just click a button to become a Jedi. You got to train, you got to work for it. But then came the update where, oh yeah, you can just push this button and now you're a Jedi class. And then suddenly the whole game fell apart. People jumped ship because now that challenge, that investment, that basically the reward for that investment was taken away. And that's another key thing with games like that, is that you've got to make the gameplay loop design, you've got to make it so that way the player is willing to invest in that experience, willing to go through that gameplay loop in order to actually, get that satisfying conclusion, whether it's beating a really, really hard boss in a very challenging action game, or finding this very, very obscure item drop in order to craft a special weapon or a special item. It's that kind of case of there needs to be that idea, that balance between the grind and the payoff that actually makes it worthwhile. And again, problem is the industry basically wants to have their cake and eat it too. They basically want to use stuff that's already been proven without actually taking the time to understand why it worked.
Okay. So we have two other aspects here that I want to get into, but I know that we're running out of time because Romney specifically has work the next day. But I want to make sure that we get to at least one of them. We're going to broach it because it's part of the other one, but I want to at least bring it up because it's going to get talked about. If you're going to increase the price, so I'm talking a lot about reducing the exorbitant budgets, and there's a reason for it. It's not just because I think you could get a lot of profit from it, but more because I think that something else could happen in the meantime, which is that you could add a little money to those budgets for quality assurance. Quality is a big thing when it comes to this $20 increase, and frankly, we're even seeing it on our chat, that if you're going to expect me to pay 20 more bucks, you better put a hell of a lot more quality into it than Fallout 76 got, all right? Or that Skyrim got, or any of that stuff. And it's a valid concern. Because here's the bottom line. If I'm paying 80 bucks for a game and it's buggy as hell, and I'm reviewing it, at that point, it's an instant 0 out of 10. Because at that point, if you can't even, you're asking us to spend this much more money because you want to do this exorbitant budget, and you're not even willing to go test it yourself. And I get that some people are going to make the justification of, well, we can get our fan bases to do it for us, or you can do Steam Greenlight. That's not what I'm talking about. You need to do it internally. And it's high time that the gaming industry needs to realize that they have to do it internally. And you can't just rely on, well, our fans are going to do it for us, because eventually the fans are going to get pissed, like they did with 76. And especially when they feel that the companies are no longer listening to them. I just barely saw a big hubbub in World of Warcraft where back in the day, I know this is a foreign concept for Romney, but they used to listen to their hardcore game audience and say like, oh, well, maybe if you fix this little thing, it would actually help the overall gaming experience. And then they implement it, and it worked. But now, unfortunately, Activision Blizzard has a real problem with putting, well, pretentious asshats in charge of the communities. And so then they come off with a cocky, pretentious attitude in these forums, don't listen to any of the feedback that's being given by some of their most hardcore supporters. And then they wonder why their audiences are pissed at them, kind of thing. Like, why are you guys so insulting to us? Because you're not listening, kind of thing. And this is definitely something has to change in the next generation. Absolutely. And that's why it is going to be a bigger discussion topic in one of the later ones, but I'm bringing it up here at least a little bit. If you're going to ask us $20 extra, you would better be willing to deliver on quality insurance.
And honestly, this is probably the big difference between a company like Nintendo and a lot of these other companies, is because Nintendo understands the idea of, hey, let's actually test these and make sure they're working properly. There's a reason they still have the Super Mario Club that is basically their testing house.
Yes.
Is because they understand that. They understand, especially when designing for something that's...
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Super Mario house has a pedigree to it. Like, they're good. They're good at what they do.
Yep. I mean, there's a reason why they actually take their time with their games, and that's why they don't necessarily try to rush to get like the super advanced hardware, because it's a case of, okay, well, we could get these super advanced graphics and processors, but how is this going to translate to better game design? And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. Like I keep mentioning, so many companies focus so much on spectacle, but I guarantee you, a game, I mean, between an RPG that comes out on the Switch that is more polished, like Fire Emblem Three Houses, is going to be infinitely more interesting, even if it's not necessarily the most fanciful graphically, or may not necessarily have a lot of these bells and whistles. It'll still be a more fun game because they polished the core gameplay loop of it, as opposed to a strategy game like, well, I can't think of any major mainstream strategy games that have come out on consoles, because that's mostly a PC thing. Like XCOM was, I wouldn't necessarily equate it, because XCOM, they at least polished it.
Yeah.
I guess a better example would be something like Chrono Trigger, as opposed to, well...
See, the most recent strategy game that I could bring up is, but I wouldn't call it a franchise, so they're experimenting with putting Transformers into it. And so at that point, like, that's interesting, but it's not a series.
Yeah, I think a better way to put it, a better example would be playing a game like Chrono Trigger, which is nice and polished. It may not be the most advanced game of its time, but it did what it did very well, as opposed to Final Fantasy VIII, which tried to wow on spectacle, but because of a lot of questionable gameplay decisions, it's still, again, I know there are a lot of fans of Final Fantasy VIII, but compared to the rest of the series, it is arguably one of the weaker entries. Granted,
and some of the fan base will actually acknowledge it. So
yeah, I mean, a better example than 8 would be 13. Final Fantasy 13 is also a good example of a game that tried to rely solely on spectacle, and it didn't really work. It didn't meet those numbers. This is why people go back to games like Final Fantasy 6 and 7 as opposed to games. And that's another key thing, is that you don't need the major fancy graphics. You don't need the star power of Hollywood actors. You don't need some major established intellectual property like Marvel or Dungeons and Dragons. If the game is good and polished and well executed, people will play it, and then they will tell their friends about it, and then their friends will play it.
Yeah, it's not like there was a niche audience for Super Mario Brothers, all right? Super Mario Brothers came here. Nobody really knew what it was, especially the arcade entry. I actually meet a lot of people who don't even know what that original entry was. And so at that point, you didn't have the audience there, but yet they found a way to do it. It's one of those things where I'd like to bring up Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And if you build it and it's good, they will come. Kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean... especially with the way gaming kind of transitioned from the arcade to consoles, a good example would be a game like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, where many people who bought game consoles, I mean, when you look at in Japan, Dragon Quest, they understood, the original creators of Dragon Quest, of the very first one, understood, hey, this very complex RPG genre that we like that comes from the West, that's going to be a bit of a hard sell. Let's find a way to simplify it so that way Japanese gamers, get a little bit easier. Okay, the first game we just stick with the very basic one-party system, one-character system. Okay, that did well. Okay, let's introduce the idea of multiple characters in a party in the next game. And they slowly built on it because they understood, hey, we know this genre is a bit of a tough sell, and now it's one of the biggest JRPG franchises in the world. Yeah. And it's the same case with a game like Mario or a game like Pikmin. With Pikmin, that was a very risky title, but because they knew what they set out to do, they knew what they were trying to do. People played it, people liked it, and now you've got 3 games gone. 3 games.
Exactly. So we pretty much hit the last. We pretty much hit this quality assurance. It needs to be something that is accounted for. And when we get more into that, it's going to be when we actually talk about what the overall gaming industry has to improve as a whole moving forward, especially into this new generation. All right. And so at that point, the last thing that I want to get into, because I think it is going to have a financial impact on the next generation, is that, okay, you want $80. There's this indie developer who wants $40, and he's put $60 worth of effort into a much easier game for him to make with a smaller team. Why should I be supporting your $80 game when I could be supporting that? And this has actually been a big question that I've gotten is, could this actually be the generation where indie overtakes AAA? I don't know about that. It's a bold claim. It could. Especially considering that it would be cheaper to just purchase indie games. And I'll be honest, and you've said it too in previous podcasts, we have been looking a lot more into indie games than we ever have. And for good reason, too. Like, you brought up Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. I've never finished that game. I've replayed it numerous times to finish it, and I still am getting my $60 worth out of it. Or I think actually 50 because of that. So, at this point, like, what is going to be the impact of indie on this new market and how much AAA is wanting us to pay? I actually think it's going to take a lot more hardcore gamers away from it. I don't think it's going to take the casual gamer away, but it is going to take a lot more of the hardcore audience, which a lot of these games rely on, because they're going to be more interested in what's happening in the indie scene than they are in the AAA. You there?
Yeah, and especially understand the kind of games they want. Yeah, like
okay, good.
My audio thing glitched out for a bit, but yeah, one thing that a lot of these indie developers have that a lot of these AAA publishers don't so much is they understand what it's like to be a gamer on the receiving end of a bad game. They know it's a case of, hey, we know the frustration, so let's take what we know about what doesn't work and actually implement what we know works that will better align with the type of experience we're trying to offer. And again, you've got some developers that are about creating emotional, heartfelt experiences. You've got others that are more about creating something that is just more fun and casual and not meant to be taken super seriously.
Yeah.
And it also just goes back to the ideas that AAA development is losing that passion for the craft of game design. And that's something that's really missed that you see in indie developers, is that you can tell when a game had a team that was passionate about it, that really cared about the final product.
I miss that in AAA. I really do.
Yeah, Streets of Rage 4, again, the best example that's available on the most consoles is that you can tell everybody working on it were fans of the originals and wanted to do it justice, and boy, did they do it justice.
Boy, did they, yeah.
And this is coming from someone who never played any of the previous Streets of Rage games. This was my first one, and I could even tell this labor of love.
See, what's funny is, like, you've been playing it. Me and Andrea have been wanting to get into it. We just haven't found the time this year. I swear during the holiday season we're going to. But that's all I've heard, is that there was nothing but love put into that game. Nothing but love for the Streets of Rage crowd. Nothing but love for hardcore beat-em-up fans. And it shows in every aspect of that game. And that's definitely something that I think has to be considered, is that a lot of the hardcore audience is going to leave because they don't see the passion in these games anymore. Maybe they do occasionally from people like Cory Balrog, but it's not a regular thing in the AAA industry anymore. Instead, it's more expected of the indie portion of the gaming industry than anything else. And we actually did get an interesting chat suggestion on this. But what happens when the indie game companies become AAA? Then they kind of start to adopt this stuff. Yes and no. Some indie developers will still adopt their own philosophies on it. Like you could argue Scott Cawthon's big at this point, but he still has a love for his audience.
I mean, a better example in terms of an actual company would be a company like WayForward, where they were a bit of a smaller studio, but they've gotten successful enough that now Shantae is kind of an established brand now. Granted, it's more still a very relatively niche, obscure brand, but they've gone from making a small little game on the Game Boy to being able to commission Studio Trigger to make an opening for their more recent game.
Exactly.
And so it's very much, it goes back to that core idea of not losing that passion as you get bigger, while also being smart about it, because that's what happened with Telltale, is that they got really big. The passion was there, but they didn't really have the know-how to keep things going, and that's why they crashed and burned as horribly as they did.
And they weren't willing to bring in the people that would have helped them with that, because they saw them as, we don't need that. And that ultimately contributed to their downfall. Whereas you have companies like, I like that you brought up WayForward. WayForward is a perfect example of this, where they've done AAA efforts as well as indie efforts, and they've been able to maintain their vision. I think another one that has been slowly slinking into people's minds is Yacht Club. Yacht Club has been able to find a way to maintain their own passion while becoming powerhouses in their own right, to the point where we're actually looking at things like Cyber Shadow basically being AA or even AAA in terms of its scope. So at that point, it's one of those deals where it just depends on the company that you're dealing with. But if the company truly has the passion, if the crew that is working together, then you won't have that problem. You won't have them adopting AAA ideals. Especially in some cases where you might actually be looking at these studios and they're, out in the middle of Nebraska somewhere, as opposed to all the coffee shops in California, kind of thing, which I think is a contributing factor to a lot of that.
Because I mean, there's even companies here in Utah that have been finding ways to establish themselves. Granted, they've had highs and lows. I know that was the case with Avalanche, which got some fair prominence by working on games for Disney, but because of the failure of Disney Infinity, I mean, I know they're still around. It's just that's what happens with any company. Sometimes an idea you invest in
didn't
works
they
well for
just
a while.
barely announce a game?
I think so, but
I can't remember it though.
I can't remember. I just know that they are still open, and I do believe they are still working with Disney, but they did have to change a lot of their operations after Disney Infinity was shut down, because that market of the toy-based augmented gaming kind of burst, where parents and gamers kind of got fed up with it, and that's why you don't see much of either Skylanders or Disney Infinity much anymore, because...
No.
And so it's kind of that same case where, like any industry, there's those peaks and valleys where sometimes you're doing well, sometimes you've got to tighten your belt a little bit and then keep powering through. I mean, people forget that, especially here in Utah, that's what we saw with companies like Maxis before EA got its grubby little hands on it.
Yeah.
With things like SimCity and The Sims and a lot of the related games that took off and became very popular because they kind of knew what they were trying to do. Again, before Electronic Arts happened.
Exactly, and we have tons of other stories with that one. The other one that comes to my mind is Sculpture Softworks. That was another one that suffered a lot when EA started moving into our market too. But so unfortunately we have run out of time, because again, we need to make sure that people can get to bed on time for their work shift, because the holidays are a tragic thing. They are busy for everybody. So at that point, I think we've had an amazing discussion. I actually want to thank the live chat as well. They brought up also amazing points that I wish we could have gotten to all of them. But I have a feeling what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a lot of these and we're going to bring them up tomorrow when we're playing Final Fantasy 15. So me and Andrea can kind of tackle them as well. And I don't know, maybe we'll get somebody to call in. I don't know. We'll figure crap out.